If you are seeing this, Sebastian, phone number is still the same. Call me. I will come and pick you up. I don't care where you're at. If I gotta get a boat, I'll come pick you up, son. I'm looking for you, and I won't stop until I find you. I love you, boy, and I will always love you.
Hello. Early for the polygraph, Mr. Kendall contacted me and told me that he'd be there well before the time that we had stated. So I showed up and I sat in the chair and let him attach those things to me and took the polygraph.
Have you ever had a polygraph before?
No, ma'am.
And so what kind of questions did the polygrapher Kendall Schewel ask you?
If I had ever wanted to harm anybody, if I ever wanted to hurt my son, if I had ever hurt my son, if I'd ever had anything to do with his disappearance.
In most child disappearance cases, the biological father usually vanishes from the story. But in the Sebastian Rogers case, the father was everywhere on national television, YouTube live streams, outside police stations, in debates with investigators. Seth Rogers wasn't considered a suspect. He wasn't named as a person of interest. But he was the one who completely shifted public perception of the case. The question isn't what Seth did, but rather, why did a non-suspect father become the most dangerous pivot point of the entire story? In the earliest phase of the Sebastian Rogers case, one fact stands out with unusual clarity: Seth Rogers was never positioned as a criminal suspect. This is not an inference. It is a documented absence. Across the earliest interviews, law enforcement interactions, and media appearances, Seth's role was defined narrowly and consistently as the biological father living separately from the child, notified after the disappearance, and procedurally cleared at the outset. That framing matters, because in missing child cases, the biological parent, especially the father, is often scrutinized first. Here, that did not happen. Seth Rogers did not live with Sebastian at the time of the disappearance. Sebastian was staying at the home of his mother and stepfather. Seth resided elsewhere and maintained a shared custody arrangement. This physical separation is not a minor detail. It directly shaped the initial investigative posture. When Sebastian was reported missing, Seth was not present at the location where the disappearance occurred. He entered the timeline only after receiving a message that something was wrong. According to Seth's earliest account, the notification came immediately after he finished a long work shift. He described working approximately 12 hours prior to learning that Sebastian was missing. The communication itself is notable for its wording. Seth reported receiving a text message instructing him to call, describing the situation as 911. When he returned the call, he was told that Sebastian could not be found and that he needed to come to the house. At that point, Seth drove directly to the residence and remained there for the remainder of the day. From an investigative standpoint, this sequence matters because it establishes both timing and access. Seth was not at the residence during the overnight window when Sebastian disappeared. His location during that time was verifiable through employment records. Law enforcement treated this as an alibi, not as a claim requiring prolonged dispute. Seth himself stated that officers asked where he had been, confirmed that he had been working, and proceeded to verify that information. One procedural detail reinforces this point: Seth's phone was taken by law enforcement early in the process. This is standard practice in missing person cases, particularly when investigators want to confirm timelines, communications, and geolocation data. Seth did not describe resistance to this step, nor did he claim it was improper. Instead, he explained it as part of routine verification, checking whether statements could be corroborated. There is no indication in the material you provided that this phone examination produced evidence implicating him, nor that it escalated his status beyond that of a cooperating parent. Crucially, at no point in the early record did law enforcement publicly name Seth Rogers as a suspect or person of interest. This absence persists across multiple media platforms and over time. Even as tensions grew later in the case, even as Seth became more vocal and critical, no official source identified him as being under suspicion for Sebastian's disappearance. That fact alone places Seth in a different category from many high-profile missing child cases, where parents are often named early or indirectly framed through strategic language. The earliest media portrayal of Seth reflects this positioning. In his initial televised appearance, Seth is introduced simply as the biological father. His demeanor is controlled, his language focused on facts rather than accusations. He does not assign blame. He does not speculate publicly about criminal responsibility. Instead, he focuses on what does not make sense to him, based on the physical circumstances surrounding Sebastian's disappearance. Those circumstances become the first logical anchor of Seth's narrative, the shoes and the phone. According to Seth, Sebastian's shoes were still at the front door. His phone was left inside the house, in the kitchen. These are not emotionally charged details, they are behavioral indicators. Seth did not describe them as proof of a crime, but as inconsistencies with the idea that Sebastian simply walked away on his own. From an investigative perspective, this distinction matters. Seth was not constructing a theory of guilt. He was highlighting anomalies. The argument he presented was narrow: a teenager with no history of wandering, no pattern of leaving home unannounced, and a known aversion to being barefoot would be unlikely to leave in the middle of the night without shoes or a phone. This is not a claim of certainty, it is a challenge to a specific hypothesis. Importantly, Seth's reasoning did not rely on emotional appeals. He did not invoke fear, intuition, or parental instinct as evidence. He pointed instead to routine behavior. He referenced a prior incident involving fire ants that, according to him, shaped Sebastian's long-standing habit of wearing socks and shoes even outdoors. Whether or not investigators ultimately accepted this reasoning, it functioned as a baseline behavioral profile, not an accusation. This approach shaped Seth's initial role in the public narrative. He was not asking law enforcement to arrest anyone. He was not demanding charges. He was asking for continued searching and for logic to be applied consistently. In the earliest stage, his concern was not that someone had committed a crime, but that the available explanations did not align with the facts as he understood them. That distinction is critical when evaluating Seth's later evolution. At the beginning, he positioned himself as aligned with the investigative process. He described watching officers come and go from the house. He referenced K-9 units, interviews, and procedural steps without hostility. His frustration, at this stage, was not directed at specific individuals but at uncertainty itself. From an investigative standpoint, this creates a clean baseline. Seth's early narrative is restrained. It is anchored in verifiable facts: his work schedule, the phone check, his absence from the scene, and the physical details inside the home. There is no evidence in the early record that law enforcement treated him as anything other than a non-suspect family member. This matters because public perception often fills gaps that official records do not. In many cases, suspicion arises not from evidence, but from expectation, the assumption that proximity implies guilt. In Sebastian Rogers' case, that assumption did not hold. Seth's physical distance from the scene, combined with procedural verification, removed him from immediate criminal scrutiny. By establishing this early, the case creates a reference point against which everything that follows must be measured. Later statements, later accusations, later conflicts cannot be understood without acknowledging this starting position. Seth Rogers did not begin this process under suspicion. He began it cleared, cooperating, and focused on explanation rather than blame. That is the first narrative of this case, not a suspect defending himself, but a father standing outside the crime scene, asking why the available facts do not fit the simplest story. The second phase of the narrative does not begin with a new witness, a new lead, or a new theory. It begins with repetition. Seth Rogers returns, again and again, to the same two objects: a pair of shoes at the door, and a phone left inside the house. These details do not change across interviews. What changes is their weight. Over time, they become more than observations. They become the structural core of how Seth frames the entire case. It is important to be precise here. Everything in this section rests solely on Seth's statements, as presented in the transcripts you provided. Law enforcement has not publicly confirmed these details. They have also not publicly disputed them. The shoes and the phone exist in a space that is neither officially endorsed nor officially rejected. That ambiguity is where the first real fracture in the case begins to form. According to Seth, Sebastian's shoes were still at the front door when he arrived at the house. His phone was inside, in the kitchen. Seth does not describe these details with embellishment. He does not dramatize them. He states them plainly, often in response to direct questions about whether Sebastian could have simply left on his own. In those moments, the shoes and the phone are not presented as evidence of a crime, but as obstacles to a specific explanation. The logic is narrow and consistent. A teenager who leaves voluntarily, especially at night, would be expected to take at least one of two things: shoes or a phone. The absence of both is what Seth finds implausible. He does not say it is impossible. He says it does not make sense. That phrasing matters. It is the language of probability, not accusation. What gives this argument additional weight, in Seth's telling, is what he describes as a behavioral baseline. He repeatedly references an earlier incident involving fire ants. According to Seth, Sebastian once stepped into what he thought was dirt and was bitten. After that, Seth says, Sebastian developed a strong aversion to being barefoot outdoors. Socks and shoes were not optional, they were routine. This is not presented as a psychological diagnosis or a clinical claim. It is presented as lived experience. Again, the key point is not whether this account is objectively verifiable, but how Seth uses it. He does not introduce the fire ants story once and move on. He returns to it across platforms, television interviews, live streams, call-ins. The detail remains stable. That stability is unusual in emotionally charged cases, where narratives often shift or expand. Here, the repetition suggests deliberateness. From an investigative perspective, this repetition functions as anchoring. By continuously returning to shoes and the phone, Seth limits the interpretive field. He is not asking the audience to consider dozens of possibilities. He is asking them to confront one specific inconsistency. In doing so, he effectively frames the debate before it begins. Any explanation that does not account for those two objects is, in his view, incomplete. This is where the first crack appears, not between Seth and law enforcement, but between Seth's logic and the silence surrounding it. Law enforcement does not publicly validate his claims. There are no press statements confirming the location of the shoes or the phone. There are also no statements denying them. This absence creates a vacuum. Into that vacuum, Seth's version of events gains disproportionate influence. The lack of confirmation matters because these details, if accurate, significantly constrain plausible scenarios. A voluntary departure becomes harder to defend. An impulsive act becomes less likely. But because law enforcement does not publicly weigh in, the audience is left to navigate the discrepancy on its own. Seth's narrative fills that space by default. This dynamic subtly shifts the power balance in the case. Seth is no longer just responding to questions, he is setting terms. The shoes and the phone become what might be called a fact anchor, a reference point that remains fixed even as other elements of the case remain fluid. Every time Seth speaks, he pulls the conversation back to those objects. In doing so, he resists narrative drift. What makes this particularly notable is that Seth does not attach blame to the details. He does not say the shoes prove foul play. He does not say the phone proves abduction. Instead, he positions them as contradictions. The effect is cumulative. Over time, the repeated emphasis creates a sense that something essential is being overlooked. From a forensic standpoint, this is a risky strategy. Anchoring too strongly to unconfirmed details can narrow investigative thinking. But from a narrative standpoint, it is effective. The audience begins to associate the case with a specific image: an empty doorway, shoes untouched, a phone left behind. That image is difficult to reconcile with a benign explanation. The fire ants detail amplifies this effect. It introduces a personal, experiential element that feels specific rather than generic. Many missing person cases involve claims about behavior. Few involve such a concrete sensory memory. Whether or not investigators consider it probative, it resonates with listeners because it suggests consistency over time. Seth is not describing a one-off preference, he is describing a pattern. At the same time, this is where the tension with law enforcement begins to surface, even if only implicitly. By repeatedly highlighting details that are not publicly addressed by investigators, Seth creates an impression, intentional or not, that those details are being ignored. He does not explicitly accuse law enforcement of neglect at this stage, but the implication is there: if these facts matter, why are they not being discussed? This is the first moment where Seth's narrative and the official silence begin to diverge. It is subtle. There are no confrontations yet, no raised voices, but the alignment that existed earlier, where Seth described watching officers work and accepted procedural limits, starts to strain. The shoes and the phone become symbols not just of Sebastian's disappearance, but of an information gap. Importantly, law enforcement's refusal to publicly confirm or deny these details may be entirely procedural. Investigators often withhold specifics to protect the integrity of a case, but in the absence of explanation, silence takes on meaning. Seth's repetition ensures that the silence does not go unnoticed. From an investigative storytelling perspective, this is the point where the case begins to fracture into parallel narratives. One is official and opaque, the other is personal and detailed. Neither is conclusively wrong, neither is conclusively right, but they are no longer fully aligned. The shoes and the phone thus serve a dual function. On the surface, they are physical details about a missing teenager. Beneath that, they mark the moment when Seth transitions from participant to narrator. He is no longer simply answering questions, he is asserting a framework. Within that framework, explanations must account for behavior, habit, and consistency. This does not make Seth correct, it makes him central. By choosing these details as his focal point, he ensures that any future development, any new theory, any new lead will be measured against them. That is the power of a fact anchor. Once established, it is difficult to dislodge. And yet, because these details remain unconfirmed by law enforcement, they also remain vulnerable. If later contradicted, they could undermine Seth's credibility. If later confirmed, they could validate his persistence. At this stage, neither outcome has occurred. The case exists in suspension. What can be said with certainty is this: the shoes and the phone are not incidental to Seth Rogers' role in this case. They are foundational. They are the lens through which he views the disappearance, and the lens through which he asks others to view it. In returning to them repeatedly, Seth does not escalate emotionally. He escalates structurally. This is the first crack, not a rupture, but a visible strain between a father's logic and an investigation that has not publicly responded to it. Everything that follows will build on this moment, when two unattended objects at a doorway begin to carry more weight than anyone initially expected. The third phase of the case does not begin with an accusation. It begins with a procedural decision that, in Seth Rogers' telling, defied the logic he had relied on until that point. The order was simple and abrupt: stop searching. For a father who had accepted uncertainty, delays, and limited communication as part of an ongoing investigation, this was the moment when cooperation quietly turned into skepticism. According to Seth, the instruction to halt community searching coincided with a shift in investigative focus toward a landfill. This pairing cessation of broad search efforts alongside a narrowed, high-stakes direction was never explained to him in detail. He was not told what prompted the change, what evidence supported it, or how it altered the overall strategy. What he understood was the outcome: people were being told not to search, while investigators pursued a line of inquiry that suggested a far more severe possibility. From an investigative standpoint, asking civilians to stop searching is not unprecedented. It can occur when an area has been thoroughly covered, when conditions become unsafe, or when evidence preservation becomes a concern. But in missing person cases, especially those involving children, such decisions are usually accompanied, at least privately, by explanation to immediate family. Seth's account indicates that this did not happen. He was left with a directive, not a rationale. This is where the case takes its first sharp turn. Up to this point, Seth had largely accepted his position outside the investigative core. He described watching officers work, waiting for updates, and limiting his own actions in accordance with instructions. The halt in searching, however, confronted him with a contradiction that he could not reconcile quietly. How could searching be discouraged when the child had not been found? The answer, implicitly suggested by the landfill focus, was that investigators may have been operating under a different assumption about what they were looking for. Seth was never told explicitly that investigators believed Sebastian was deceased. But the direction itself carried weight. Landfills are not searched lightly. They represent a terminal hypothesis. For a parent still holding on to the possibility of recovery, the pivot was jarring. Seth's response to this moment is critical because it marks the first time he steps beyond the role of a waiting father and into the role of a questioning participant. He does not accuse investigators of misconduct. He does not claim they are wrong. Instead, he expresses confusion repeatedly and publicly about why searching would stop at precisely the moment when urgency should peak. The abnormality Seth highlights is not technical, it is structural. Community searches are, by nature, redundant and imperfect. They are also expansive. They rely on numbers rather than precision. Ending them signals a narrowing of focus. Without explanation, that narrowing appears arbitrary. Seth's concern is not that investigators are following a lead, but that they are doing so without accounting for the broader implications. This is the moment when trust begins to erode not through confrontation, but through omission. Seth's frustration stems from not knowing whether the investigation is moving forward or simply moving away from him. The difference matters. Progress implies direction. Silence implies distance. Importantly, Seth does not initially challenge the authority of law enforcement. He challenges the coherence of the strategy as he understands it. In interviews, he frames his objection around logic rather than emotion. If the goal is to find Sebastian, why discourage people from looking? If the investigation has shifted, why not explain how that shift serves the same goal? These questions mark a significant evolution in Seth's public posture. He is no longer content to receive instructions without context. He is no longer satisfied with assurances that work is being done. The "stop searching" directive forces him to confront the limits of his role, and in doing so, to push against them. From an investigative perspective, this is a dangerous inflection point. Not because Seth becomes antagonistic, but because he begins to operate outside the narrative boundaries set by investigators. When official explanations are withheld, alternative interpretations fill the gap. Seth's interpretation is straightforward: something does not add up. The landfill focus intensifies this tension. Unlike other leads, it carries a psychological finality that cannot be ignored. Seth does not claim to know why investigators went there. He does not describe being briefed on evidence. He simply notes the sequence: searching stopped, the landfill became a focal point, and he was not told why. That sequence, more than any single decision, undermines his confidence. What follows is not an outburst, but a recalibration. Seth begins to articulate his concerns more openly. He starts to speak not just about Sebastian, but about process. He questions whether the investigation is aligned with its stated objective. This is the first time he publicly implies that the system itself may be misfiring not through malice, but through opacity. This distinction is important. Seth's early critiques are not personal. He does not name individual officers or agencies as adversaries. His issue is with the structure of decision-making and the absence of transparency. In that sense, his opposition is systemic rather than accusatory. The investigative value of this moment lies in what it reveals about communication breakdowns. Law enforcement investigations often prioritize secrecy to protect outcomes. Families prioritize information to sustain hope and agency. When those priorities clash without mediation, mistrust emerges. Seth's experience illustrates how quickly that mistrust can form when explanations are withheld. This is also the point where Seth's actions begin to change. Faced with a halt in community searches, he does not retreat. He expands his own efforts. He speaks more frequently. He seeks platforms. He starts to document what he perceives as inconsistencies. None of this is framed as rebellion. It is framed as necessity. From the outside, this shift can appear confrontational. From Seth's perspective, it is corrective. He believes that searching should continue until Sebastian is found, regardless of investigative direction. The landfill does not negate the need to look elsewhere, it intensifies it. This moment when searches stopped making sense is where the emotional and procedural threads of the case first diverge irreversibly. Seth's trust does not collapse all at once. It fractures along a single-line explanation versus instruction. Once that fracture appears, it widens with every unanswered question. Crucially, Seth does not yet accuse the system of failure. He questions its logic. That restraint matters. It preserves his credibility at a stage when escalation would be premature. But it also signals a turning point. He is no longer content to wait passively for answers. He is preparing, consciously or not, to challenge the framework itself. In investigative terms, this is the moment when Seth transitions from stakeholder to critic. He is still cooperative. He still follows directives. But his faith in the coherence of the process has been shaken. The stop searching order is not just a tactical decision, it is a message one that Seth receives without translation. This is why this phase matters more than later confrontations. It is not defined by anger or accusation, but by dissonance. The system moves in one direction. Seth's understanding moves in another. Between them lies a silence that neither side immediately bridges. Everything that follows the hiring of private investigators, the public pressure, the escalating rhetoric can be traced back to this moment. When searches stopped making sense, Seth Rogers stopped being merely the father of a missing boy. He became a man questioning the machinery tasked with finding him. By the time Seth Rogers appeared on television, the language had shifted. Not in volume, not in emotion, but in structure. He no longer speaks mainly about what did not make sense at the scene. He spoke about alignment or the absence of it. The phrase he used was simple and devastating in its implication. This doesn't feel like a shared goal anymore. In a missing person investigation, that sentence marks a rupture. The appearance itself matters. Banfield is not a local platform. It is a national one. Seth did not come to plead for sympathy or repeat a description. He came to assess progress. He spoke about time elapsed, leads that went nowhere, and the growing sense that effort and outcome were drifting apart. He did not accuse investigators of inactivity. He questioned whether activity was translating into movement. That distinction is subtle, but it defines the moment. At this stage, Seth acknowledged the presence of a private investigator. This is not uncommon in high-profile or prolonged cases, but its timing is critical. The PI did not appear at the outset. The PI appeared after searches were halted, after explanations thinned, and after Seth perceived a widening gap between what he was being told and what he could observe. The decision to bring in a PI was not framed as defiance. It was framed as supplementation. Seth's description of this arrangement is careful. He does not claim that the PI replaces law enforcement. He explains that leads he encounters are funneled through the PI first, then passed on. This creates a parallel track one that runs alongside the official investigation without overtly colliding with it. The existence of that track is itself a signal Seth no longer believes a single channel is sufficient. Here, the concept of a shared goal becomes central. In missing person investigations, a shared goal is often assumed rather than articulated. Everyone wants the same thing the child found. But goals are not defined by desire alone. They are defined by method, priority, and communication. Seth's statement suggests that while the stated objective remains unchanged, the perceived paths toward it have diverged. From Seth's perspective, the divergence is measured in answers. He asks a question that becomes emblematic of this phase: are investigators closer now than they were at the beginning? It is not an emotional question. It is a performance metric. When that question cannot be answered clearly, when working hard replaces moving forward, the shared goal becomes abstract. This is where Seth's role evolves again. He is no longer simply reacting to decisions made elsewhere. He is building infrastructure. The PI is part of that infrastructure. So is the spokesperson who appears alongside him. These are not ad hoc choices, they are signs of formalization. Seth is professionalizing his side of the search, not because he wants control, but because he wants visibility into progress. The paradox is unavoidable. Seth separates himself from law enforcement while remaining dependent on it. The PI cannot compel subpoenas. The spokesperson cannot access sealed evidence. Seth still relies on agencies for confirmation, escalation, and authority. His independence is real, but it is incomplete. That incompleteness creates friction. In Banfield's interview, this friction surfaces without hostility. Seth acknowledges that investigators convey effort. He does not dispute that work is being done. But effort without transparency does not satisfy him. The lack of a clear answer to whether the case has advanced becomes, in his mind, evidence of stagnation. Not failure, stagnation. This is a crucial distinction. Seth is not saying the system is broken. He is saying it is no longer synchronized with his understanding of urgency. That desynchronization is what makes the goal feel unshared. The words matter. He does not say they don't care. He says it doesn't feel shared. The emphasis is on alignment, not intent. Analyzing the concept of a shared goal requires stepping back from personalities and examining process. In an ideal investigation, law enforcement and family operate within complementary roles. Investigators control information to protect outcomes. Families amplify awareness to generate tips. When communication flows, these roles reinforce each other. When it stalls, they compete. Seth's experience illustrates how easily competition emerges from silence. When he cannot determine whether the investigation is closer to resolution, he fills the gap with action. The PI chases leads. The spokesperson presses for answers. Media appearances multiply. None of this is inherently adversarial, but each step increases the distance between Seth and the official narrative. The investigative value of this phase lies in understanding consequences. Parallel investigations can surface overlooked details. They can also contaminate witness pools, harden narratives, and create confirmation bias. Seth's actions carry both potential benefit and risk. What makes this moment pivotal is that those risks are no longer theoretical, they are operational. Seth does not appear oblivious to this. He repeatedly emphasizes that information gathered on his side is passed along. He does not claim exclusivity. He does not suggest withholding. This suggests an attempt to maintain cooperation, even as trust erodes. But cooperation without shared understanding is fragile. The presence of a spokesperson adds another layer. Communication becomes curated. Language becomes disciplined. This is a departure from earlier appearances, where Seth spoke directly and personally. The shift indicates awareness of stakes. It also indicates that the case has moved beyond spontaneous expression into strategic messaging. From a systemic perspective, this is the moment when Seth becomes an independent actor within the case. He is no longer simply a source of information or a recipient of updates. He is a node generating pressure, shaping public perception, and influencing how the investigation is discussed. That influence is real, even if unintended. The danger is not that Seth is wrong. The danger is that independence without full information can amplify misalignment. When Seth asks whether the case is closer today than it was months ago, he is asking a question investigators may not be able to answer publicly. Their silence, however justified, reinforces his sense of separation. This is how shared goals dissolve not through disagreement about outcomes, but through divergence in acceptable uncertainty. Investigators can tolerate not knowing. Families cannot. Seth's move toward parallel action reflects that difference. It is not rebellion, it is an attempt to restore agency. By articulating that the goal no longer feels shared, Seth names what has been implicit since searches were halted. The investigation and the family are moving on parallel tracks, intersecting occasionally but no longer synchronized. That realization changes everything that follows. From this point forward, Seth is not just reacting to the system, he is acting upon it. He applies pressure not to individuals, but to structures, communication protocols, jurisdictional boundaries, escalation thresholds. His independence increases his visibility and his risk. He gains a voice, but loses insulation. This is the moment when Seth Rogers becomes more than a father in the story. He becomes a force within it, independent, persistent, and increasingly difficult for the system to absorb or ignore. Whether that force brings the truth closer or pushes it further away remains unresolved. What is clear is that once the shared goal fractures, the case cannot return to its original shape. This phase of the case marks a decisive shift not in evidence, but in language. For the first time, Seth Rogers moves beyond questioning process and enters the territory of attribution. The statement is unequivocal in form and destabilizing in effect. His mother is responsible. In the same appearance, almost in the same breath, Seth also says, everything is speculation. The coexistence of those two statements defines this chapter. Together, they create a contradiction that cannot be resolved by emotion or intent alone. It is a contradiction of standards. Up to this point, Seth's public posture had been framed around logic gaps and procedural opacity. He asked why searches stopped. He asked why answers were withheld. He emphasized anomalies, shoes, a phone, a trail that ended. Those were challenges to explanations, not claims of guilt. With the court TV appearance, that line is crossed. Responsibility is named, yet certainty is simultaneously denied. From an investigative standpoint, this is not merely a rhetorical escalation, it is a category change. Questioning asks for clarification. Accusation assigns burden. Once responsibility is asserted publicly, the conversation is no longer about what does not make sense, it is about who bears fault for what happened. The fact that Seth qualifies this assertion as speculation does not neutralize its impact. In public discourse, attribution travels faster than caveats. The internal tension in Seth's language is striking. On one hand, he acknowledges the absence of confirmed evidence. On the other, he frames responsibility as at least negligence. This distinction matters. Negligence and culpability are not interchangeable, either legally or ethically. Negligence implies a failure to exercise reasonable care. Culpability implies blameworthiness tied to causation. By invoking negligence, at a bare minimum, Seth attempts to occupy a middle ground asserting fault without alleging intent. That middle ground is unstable. In criminal investigations, negligence can be relevant, but it does not equate to criminal liability unless codified by statute and supported by evidence. In the public arena, however, negligence often collapses into culpability. The nuance is lost. What remains is the impression of blame. This is the point at which Seth's narrative becomes irreversible in media terms. Prior to this, his criticisms could be interpreted as pressure on process. After this, they are interpreted as accusations against a person. The shift does not depend on whether the accusation is accurate or provable. It depends on the fact that it has been voiced. The consequences are immediate and structural. Once an individual is publicly named as responsible, even conditionally, every subsequent detail is filtered through that frame. Silence becomes suspicious. Legal restraint is read as evasion. The investigative environment changes, not because facts have changed, but because expectations have. Analyzing the boundary Seth crosses requires careful separation of roles. As a father, he is responding to loss, uncertainty, and prolonged ambiguity. As a public figure in a national broadcast, he is shaping a narrative that will outlive any single interview. The court TV platform amplifies this effect. Statements made there do not remain local or ephemeral. They are archived, excerpted, and repeated. Seth's attempt to hedge by emphasizing speculation reveals an awareness of this risk. He does not claim proof. He does not present documents. He does not say charges should be filed, yet the declaration of responsibility functions independently of those disclaimers. In media logic, the headline is not speculation acknowledged. The headline is the accusation. From a forensic perspective, this creates multiple downstream effects. Potential witnesses may recalibrate their willingness to speak. Some may align themselves with the accusation, others may withdraw entirely, fearing misinterpretation. Investigators may further restrict information to avoid prejudicing the case. Defense counsel, if any party retains one, may advise silence. The informational ecosystem contracts. This contraction is not hypothetical. It is a known consequence of public attribution in unresolved cases. Once blame is named, even tentatively, the investigation must navigate not only evidence, but narrative risk. Every action is scrutinized through the lens of perceived alignment or opposition. The distinction between negligence and culpability becomes critical here. Negligence, as Seth frames it, suggests a failure of supervision or judgment. It does not require an allegation of direct involvement in a crime, but in public perception, that distinction rarely holds. Responsibility implies causation. Causation implies guilt. The slope is steep. What makes this moment particularly consequential is that Seth does not present new evidence to support the shift. The facts on the table remain the same: the disappearance timeline, the anomalies at the house, the halted searches. the lack of communication. What changes is the conclusion drawn from those facts. The move from inference to attribution is not driven by discovery, it is driven by exhaustion. From an investigative lens, that exhaustion is understandable but dangerous. Long-running uncertainty pressures participants to resolve ambiguity. When institutions cannot provide resolution, individuals often supply their own. Seth's accusation can be read as an attempt to force clarity where none has been offered. The problem is that forced clarity can harden prematurely. Once an accusation is public, retreat is interpreted as reversal, not caution. The media does not easily accommodate recalibration. This is why this phase is a point of no return. Not because Seth cannot change his view, but because the narrative has already absorbed it. There is also a legal asymmetry at play. Seth, as a private individual speaking publicly, assumes personal risk. The named party, constrained by counsel or investigation, may not respond. The imbalance favors the accuser in the short term and complicates the investigative environment in the long term. This does not invalidate Seth's concerns, it contextualizes their impact. Importantly, Seth's language still stops short of alleging a specific crime. He does not describe a mechanism, a motive, or an act. He names responsibility without method. This ambiguity is both protective and corrosive. It avoids explicit defamation while inviting inference. The space between those two outcomes is where public speculation thrives. From the standpoint of investigative value, this moment is decisive because it transforms the case into a contested narrative. Prior phases involved friction with process. This phase introduces friction between people. Once that occurs, the investigation must contend with competing truths, not just missing facts. This is also the phase where Seth's credibility becomes bifurcated. To some, his willingness to speak plainly signals courage. To others, it signals recklessness. Neither interpretation is grounded in new evidence. Both are grounded in tone. That polarization further entrenches positions and reduces the space for neutral analysis. The irreversibility of this shift lies in its visibility. A question can be forgotten. An accusation is remembered. Even if later evidence contradicts it, the initial claim remains part of the record. This is why investigative professionals caution against public attribution absent corroboration. The cost is not only legal, it is epistemic. In moving from questions to accusations, Seth Rogers alters the terrain of the case. He does not do so by introducing proof, but by changing the burden of explanation. From this point forward, silence is no longer neutral. Process is no longer presumed. Every action or inaction is read as confirmation or avoidance. This is the point where media logic overtakes investigative logic. The case is no longer driven solely by what can be established, but by what has been asserted. Whether that assertion ultimately aligns with evidence is a question for the future. What is certain is that once responsibility is named publicly, the path back to purely procedural critique is closed. This is why Part 5 is not just another chapter, it is a threshold. After this moment, the story cannot return to its earlier shape. The questions that once defined the case are replaced by claims that demand answers not from the system alone, but from individuals now placed under the weight of public responsibility. This phase of the case introduces material unlike anything that came before it. Until now, the narrative has revolved around present-day actions, a disappearance, a search, procedural decisions, and public statements. In this chapter, Seth Rogers reaches backward in time and places prior allegations into the foreground. The effect is immediate and destabilizing. The case is no longer confined to what happened on one night. It becomes entangled with claims about a past that, according to Seth, carries relevance to the present. It is essential to establish boundaries at the outset. Everything described in this section originates from Seth's statements. No independent documentation has been presented in the materials you provided to confirm or refute these claims. Some elements are described as having involved authorities. Others are asserted without records shown. The distinction between alleged, unverified, and documented is therefore not semantic, it is foundational. Seth alleges that, while living in California, Sebastian was involved in a serious incident involving inappropriate conduct with another child several years earlier. He describes the incident using explicit language and states that it occurred in the mother's residence. According to Seth, Child Protective Services and a local sheriff's department were involved at the time. He further claims that no prosecution occurred because of the ages involved, and that the other child's identifying information was withheld from him. These statements, as presented, fall into the category of alleged past inappropriate conduct involving a minor. Seth asserts institutional involvement, but no case numbers, formal reports, or third-party confirmations appear in the record you provided. That absence does not invalidate the claim. It places it within a specific evidentiary category. The allegation exists because it has been publicly stated by a parent, but its factual status remains unverified within the available materials. Seth also references additional welfare checks. He claims that at another point he requested a welfare check due to concerns that Sebastian was in proximity to a registered offender. Again, this is an allegation grounded in Seth's account. He states that the individual had a criminal history and that he believed the environment posed a risk. As with the earlier allegation, no independent confirmation is included in the provided documents. From an investigative perspective, these claims introduce a second axis of analysis, not what happened, but what history is being invoked to explain what happened. The question is not whether the past allegations are true or false. The question is how they function within the current narrative. Seth frames these past events as establishing a pattern of risk and negligence. In his telling, they contextualize his later statement that the mother is responsible, at least through negligence. This is a logical construction. If prior harm occurred under similar supervision, then present harm becomes more plausible. The structure is coherent. The evidentiary status is not. This is where the distinction between fact, record, and memory becomes critical. A fact is something that can be independently verified. A record is documentation created contemporaneously by an institution. A memory is an account shaped by perspective, time, and emotion. Seth's statements occupy all three spaces simultaneously, and that overlap is precisely what makes this section so volatile. If the alleged incident occurred as described and was formally documented by authorities, it would constitute relevant background information. It would speak to prior interventions, risk evaluations, and protective decisions made at the time. If, however, the events are remembered inaccurately, incompletely, or lack supporting documentation, their public introduction carries significant risk, not only for individuals named or implied, but for the integrity of the investigation itself. This is why bringing past allegations into an active missing person case is a double-edged act. On one side, it can surface overlooked patterns. On the other, it can weaponize memory. Once public, such allegations reshape how every present-day fact is interpreted. Neutral details acquire ominous undertones. Silence becomes suggestive. Absence of confirmation is read as concealment. From a legal standpoint, the risks are substantial. Allegations involving serious misconduct against a minor are among the most damaging claims that can be made publicly. Even when substantiated, they require careful handling to avoid re-traumatization and defamation. When unverified, their impact can far exceed their evidentiary value. The media environment does not pause to distinguish categories or levels of proof. It amplifies. Seth appears aware of this tension, but proceeds nonetheless. His justification is implicit. These are not new accusations. They are part of a history he believes was inadequately addressed. By introducing them, he seeks to explain why he distrusts assurances and why he perceives negligence as a through line rather than an isolated failure. The investigative value of this move lies in what it reveals about motivation and framing. Seth is no longer arguing solely from the present. He is constructing a longitudinal narrative. That narrative suggests that the disappearance cannot be understood without acknowledging earlier decisions and environments. Whether investigators accept that premise is unknown. What is clear is that the public will. However, the absence of corroboration creates an evidentiary asymmetry. The accused parties are constrained in their ability to respond. Institutions' name may be bound by confidentiality laws. Records, if they exist, may be sealed. In that silence, the allegation stands unopposed not because it is proven, but because it is unanswerable in public. This is why the term weaponized memory is not hyperbole. Memory becomes weaponized when it is deployed not merely to recall, but to compel interpretation. Seth's recounting of a prior alleged incident does not sit neutrally alongside present facts. It presses upon them, narrowing how those facts are read and implicitly demanding a conclusion. For investigators, this is a complicating factor. They must now consider whether the past allegations are relevant leads, contextual background, or distractions that risk contaminating witness testimony. Each option carries cost. Ignoring the claims may appear negligent. Pursuing them may divert resources. Addressing them publicly may be impossible. The emotional weight of these allegations also changes how Seth himself is perceived. Some will view his disclosure as courageous transparency. Others will view it as strategic escalation. Both interpretations can coexist without resolution because the underlying facts remain inaccessible. It is critical to note what Seth does not provide in this phase. He does not produce documents. He does not cite dates, case numbers, or names. He does not claim that these past events directly caused the disappearance. He positions them as context, not proof. That restraint matters, but it does not neutralize impact. From a cold investigative standpoint, the safest classification of this material is as follows: alleged past incidents with claimed institutional involvement, unverified within the present record, introduced publicly to contextualize current accusations of negligence. Anything beyond that would exceed the available evidence. This is the most sensitive section of the case because it collapses temporal distance. The past is no longer background, it is active. It shapes perception, expectation, and judgment. Once introduced, it cannot be retracted without consequence. The cost of this move is not abstract. It alters how the case will be remembered, regardless of outcome. If Sebastian is found, and the past allegations are substantiated, their early disclosure may be seen as prescient. If the allegations are disproven or irrelevant, their introduction may be seen as reckless. In neither scenario does the narrative revert to its earlier, narrower scope. This is why Part 6 stands apart from the others. It is not about searching, communication, or alignment. It is about the ethics of disclosure under uncertainty. It is about how far back a narrative can reach before it becomes unmoored from verifiable ground. For the investigation, this material is radioactive. It may contain truth. It may contain distortion. It may contain both. Handling it requires discipline that public discourse rarely affords. Yet once spoken, it must be accounted for. In raising these allegations, Seth Rogers irrevocably expands the frame of the case. He does so without proof presented, and without emotional restraint, but also without embellishment. The statements are blunt, not theatrical. Their power lies in what they imply, not what they demonstrate. This is the section where analysis must remain cold, because emotion obscures classification. The past allegations exist as claims, not conclusions. Their relevance is unresolved. Their impact is undeniable. And their presence marks another point, beyond which the case cannot return to a simpler form. There is one moment in the public record where Seth Rogers speaks without mediation, without compression, and without visible narrative control. No anchors steer the conversation. No spokesperson filters language. No prepared structure shapes the flow. For the first and only time, Seth speaks at length in a live setting, responding in real time, moving freely between observation, memory, and uncertainty. What emerges is not a polished account, but a dense cluster of raw details, some previously hinted at, others entirely new. This moment matters because it exposes the case in its least processed form. Seth is no longer selecting which elements to emphasize for clarity or strategy. He is transmitting what he knows, as he knows it, with minimal restraint. For investigators and analysts, such unfiltered accounts are uniquely valuable and uniquely dangerous. Seth begins by situating himself operationally rather than emotionally. He describes his daily routine traveling across cities, distributing flyers, coordinating visibility efforts, tracking where information has circulated. The scale is notable. This is not symbolic searching, it is logistical. He presents himself not as a grieving parent awaiting updates, but as an active node within a parallel effort to keep the case from stagnating. From there, Seth introduces a detail that had not previously been articulated with specificity: the involvement of K9 units and the resulting scent trail. According to his account, a dog tracked Sebastian's scent from the home to a construction site. The trail, he says, ended there. He does not interpret this endpoint. He does not assign meaning. He simply reports sequence detection, movement, termination. This specificity alters the terrain of the case. Until this point, searches were discussed in general terms, areas covered, efforts expanded or halted. The introduction of a precise termination point transforms abstraction into geography. A construction site is not just a place, it is a variable environment. Vehicles, workers, materials, and shifting ground conditions complicate interpretation. Seth does not elaborate on these factors. He does not need to. The mere mention introduces complexity. Crucially, Seth emphasizes that he was not briefed on the details of the K9 work. He explains that investigators chose not to include him in that aspect of the investigation, citing his emotional proximity. He does not dispute the reasoning. He repeats it. The phrase he uses is stark: "They don't include me." It is not shouted. It is stated as fact. This exclusion is not presented as hostility. It is presented as protocol. Yet its effect is cumulative. Seth understands why investigators limit access. What he cannot reconcile is the informational vacuum that follows. He knows something happened. He knows a trail existed. He knows where it ended. He does not know what that means, or whether it was pursued further. The tension between inclusion and exclusion becomes a recurring theme in his account. Seth describes being allowed, indeed required, to cooperate, while simultaneously being kept at arm's length from interpretation. He can search, but under conditions. He can speak, but without context. He is both participant and outsider. Another procedural detail emerges here with unusual clarity. Seth explains that his own movements, while searching, must be reported to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The stated rationale is safety and accountability. If something happens to him, investigators need to know where he was last located. On its face, this is reasonable. In practice, it underscores the asymmetry of control. Seth is monitored, but not informed. This requirement reframes his role. He is not operating independently in a legal sense. His actions are tracked. Yet the information flow remains one-directional. He provides data. He receives little. The imbalance deepens his frustration and fuels his openness. Seth also revisits the issue of phone checks, expanding on earlier references. He reiterates that his phone was examined early to confirm his location and communications. Again, this is not framed defensively. It is framed as evidence of transparency. By repeating this detail, Seth reinforces his positioning as cleared and cooperative, even as he grows increasingly vocal. The absence of narrative control in this moment allows contradictions to surface without resolution. Seth speculates cautiously, then withdraws. He acknowledges what he does not know. He oscillates between factual recounting and inferred possibility. This oscillation is not strategic, it is spontaneous. That spontaneity is what makes the material both compelling and unstable. From an investigative standpoint, this account represents the rawest data set associated with Seth's public statements. It includes operational details, procedural constraints, and partial insights into investigative activity. None of it is contextualized by law enforcement. None of it is corroborated in real time. The responsibility for interpretation falls entirely on the listener. This is where risk enters. Raw details, once public, cannot be contained. A scent trail ending at a construction site invites speculation. Without explanation, it becomes a canvas for inference. Some will see opportunity. Others will see implication. Few will see uncertainty. The conflict here is not between Seth and investigators, but between transparency and control. Seth's impulse is disclosure. Investigators' impulse is containment. Both are rational. In this unfiltered moment, disclosure temporarily overrides containment. Seth's repeated emphasis on exclusion serves a dual function. It explains gaps in his knowledge, and it justifies his openness. If he is not being briefed, he feels compelled to share what he has. Silence, in his view, benefits no one. That logic aligns with public engagement, but clashes with investigative discipline. The absence of a script reveals how much Seth is carrying simultaneously. He tracks logistics, media exposure, investigative boundaries, and personal uncertainty in a single stream of consciousness. There is no clean separation between fact and frustration. This does not discredit his account. It contextualizes it. For analysts, The value of this moment lies in identifying verification targets. The construction site, the nature of the K-9 deployment, the reasons for exclusion, the protocols governing family movement. Each element is a lead, not a conclusion. The danger lies in overweighting any single detail. Without corroboration, none of these points can bear the interpretive load the public may place on them. Yet once spoken, they shape perception regardless. This is the paradox of unfiltered disclosure. It democratizes information while destabilizing accuracy. It invites participation while undermining coherence. For a case already fractured by misalignment, it accelerates divergence. What emerges in this phase is not clarity, but exposure. Seth exposes the limits of his access, the scope of his activity, and the fragments of information he has been allowed to glimpse. In doing so, he exposes the investigative process itself, its boundaries, its silences, its asymmetries. This makes the material invaluable for understanding the dynamics of the case. It also makes it volatile. Every detail demands verification. Every omission invites interpretation. The margin for error narrows. As a source, this moment must be treated with discipline. It is neither narrative nor evidence in the formal sense. It is transmission. It reveals what one actor knows, what he does not know, and how he navigates the space between. In this unfiltered account, Seth Rogers is not persuading, accusing, or defending. He is reporting imperfectly, incompletely, and in real time. That is precisely why this segment carries the highest informational yield and the highest potential for distortion. From here forward, the investigation must contend not only with facts on the ground, but with facts in circulation, facts that arrived without context, but cannot be ignored. Across the entire public record examined so far, one conclusion remains stable: there is no official hypothesis naming Seth Rogers as a suspect. Not implicitly, not procedurally, not rhetorically. This is not a claim made by Seth. It is a condition of the record itself. Law enforcement never identified him as a person of interest. No agency suggested his involvement. No warrant, affidavit, or public statement placed him within a zone of criminal suspicion. That absence is not accidental. It is the product of early verification and sustained positioning. The reasons are straightforward. Seth did not reside at the home where Sebastian disappeared. His whereabouts during the critical window were documented through employment. His phone was checked. His account was verified. From the perspective of investigative triage where proximity, access, and opportunity often determine initial focus, Seth did not meet the threshold for suspicion. The system moved past him quickly. That decision matters because it shaped everything that followed. Once a parent is ruled out early, investigators recalibrate resources toward other avenues. Once a parent is not a suspect, their statements are received as contextual rather than defensive. Seth's early role benefited from that posture. He spoke from outside the perimeter of suspicion, not within it. And yet, over time, Seth became the most influential figure in the public narrative of the case. Not because investigators elevated him, but because absence created space. Where official communication narrowed, Seth's voice expanded. Where explanations were withheld, his interpretations filled the gap. The paradox is central to understanding this case. The man who was never a suspect became the most powerful force shaping how the case was understood. This influence did not arise from authority granted by law enforcement. It arose from persistence. Seth appeared repeatedly, consistently, and insistently. He returned to the same anomalies. He highlighted the same procedural breaks. He articulated dissatisfaction without retreating. Over time, those repetitions became a frame. The audience learned to see the case through his emphasis. Narrative power, however, is not neutral. It carries consequences independent of intent. By defining what matters, shoes, a phone, halted searches, exclusion, Seth constrained the range of explanations the public considered plausible. This can be beneficial when it keeps attention on overlooked details. It can also be limiting when it hardens assumptions prematurely. The pressure Seth applied to the system followed a similar pattern. He did not accuse individual officers of wrongdoing. He challenged process. He questioned alignment. He asked whether the investigation was closer to resolution than it had been at the start. These questions, repeated publicly, exerted institutional pressure. Agencies were forced to respond not always with answers, but with posture. Silence became strategic. Communication tightened. This tightening had predictable effects. Investigators, faced with a case under scrutiny, became more guarded. Families, already excluded from interpretive loops, felt further distanced. The space between official action and public understanding widened. Into that space flowed speculation, interpretation, and competing narratives. Seth's role in this dynamic is neither purely constructive nor purely destructive. It is catalytic. His actions accelerated processes that might otherwise have unfolded slowly or quietly. Media attention increased. Public awareness remained high. Tips continued to flow. At the same time, the environment grew more volatile. Allegations, especially those involving past harm, introduced risks that could not be easily mitigated. The absence of suspicion toward Seth amplified this effect. Because he was not defending himself against allegations, his statements carried an assumption of credibility. Audiences are conditioned to distrust suspects and empathize with cleared parents. That conditioning granted Seth a platform that would not have been available had his status been ambiguous. His words were not filtered through skepticism. They were filtered through trust. This trust magnified impact. When Seth spoke, his framing mattered more than it otherwise might have. When he escalated from questions to accusations, the shift reverberated. When he disclosed unfiltered details, they circulated without the counterweight of official context. The system could not easily correct the narrative without appearing reactive or defensive. From an investigative standpoint, this creates a dilemma. Public pressure can revive stalled cases. It can also distort them. Witnesses may come forward or withdraw. Tips may increase or converge around a single theory. Investigators must weigh responsiveness against integrity, transparency against contamination. Seth's independence complicated this calculus. He was not an antagonist, but he was not controllable. He operated parallel to the system, intersecting with it, but not subsumed by it. That parallelism can widen the investigative aperture by surfacing new information. It can also narrow it by anchoring attention to specific interpretations. The key insight is this: Seth's lack of suspect status did not neutralize his influence, it amplified it. He was free to speak without legal constraint. He was free to criticize without self-implication. He was free to frame without rebuttal. Those freedoms shaped the case as much as any official action. Why does this matter? Because missing person investigations are not conducted in a vacuum. They unfold within ecosystems of information, trust, and perception. When a central figure occupies a position of moral authority without procedural authority, the balance shifts. Decisions made by institutions are judged against narratives shaped elsewhere. Alignment becomes harder to maintain. This does not mean Seth was wrong to speak. It means that speech itself became an intervention. Each appearance altered incentives, expectations, and interpretations. The investigation had to account not only for evidence, but for an audience increasingly oriented by a single voice. The record, taken as a whole, supports a clear conclusion: Seth Rogers was never a suspect. It also supports a more complex observation: he became the axis around which the case turned. Not because he committed an act, but because he narrated one. The distinction is critical. Guilt and influence are not the same. Innocence does not equate to irrelevance. In this case, the absence of suspicion enabled a different kind of power, one that operates through attention rather than authority. As the case continues, the consequences of that power remain unresolved. It may lead to breakthroughs. It may entrench divisions. It may do both. What can be said is that the investigative landscape has been permanently altered by the presence of a father who was never a suspect, yet never silent. The final question, then, is not about blame. It is about effect. Not about what Seth did in the past, but about what his role has done to the present trajectory of the case. When a father is not a suspect, but becomes the loudest force in the case, does that bring the truth closer or push it further away?